be ready, then we can start.
Thank you. The international cooperation.
The event that we are proud to associate ourselves with the Foreign Policy Association, the Tailored to Pandemics, is of the utmost relevance for the United Nations. While today we may see the institutions under a very big magnifier for what is happening in the world, there is a pamphlet over there of what the United Nations does. It's a pamphlet in blue. It's a whole system in which take care of a lot of health around the world. So the history that is going to be disclosed to you today by this excellent group of panelists put it together by the Foreign Policy Association. I did a little bit of research to repeat myself from the first pandemic to the last one, and I put it in my notes and whatever was in between, because there is a lot of other things that are in between these two main events. For the United Nations, just during the 77th session of the United General Assembly, President Perosi negotiated and appointed facilitators at ambassadorial level for 8 consultative process that yield 8 major outcome documents for the United Nations, policy documents. 3 of them are just related to the topic we are going to discuss today. These declarations that were adopted at the beginning of the high-level week 15 days ago was a political declaration of the General Assembly high-level meeting on pandemic prevention. That was the second document that several cases in the Assembly adopted. The third document was political declaration on the high-level meeting on universal health coverage. And the third one was the political declaration of the high-level meeting of the fight against tuberculosis. So when I received the call from the Foreign Policy Association on this topic, I was very pleased and very well because it's embedded in the heart of the work of the United Nations and the General Assembly. And a lot of efforts have been made by member states, head of government, to achieve this kind of consensus in these areas. We are preparing for the end of the 78th session. President of the General Assembly, President France of Trinidad and Tobago, have already appointed 2 ambassadors to facilitate another outcome document in what we are calling the high-level meeting in 2024 on antimicrobial resistance. Then you wait. When it's red, you speak. It's the only place, if it's red, let you go, and green, stop it. Maybe you understand a little bit the United Nations. I don't understand it. So welcome, enjoy now to you, and thank you very much for joining.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Suazo. The world is now engaged in what legitimately can be called the Third World War. It is not what strategists had imagined decades ago. No nuclear weapons, no missiles or destructive cyber technology, but massively lethal and devastating to economies and the lives of hundreds of millions of people nonetheless. And countries are not fighting one another, but a small, unseen, and unpredictable virus that poses a threat to virtually all governments, regardless of the nature of their system or political philosophy. Tragically, the FPA was among a number of organizations in this country and around the world which warned that this could happen. In the 2000 issue of Foreign Policy Forum, I wrote, "In a globalized world, the risks of the spread of contagion are not to be minimized. For those that doubt the potential threat, it is important to remember that the year after the Foreign Policy Association was founded was marked by the influenza pandemic, which killed 20 million people worldwide, including 500,000 Americans, a greater death toll than all of World War I. I went on to say, FBA members take a keen interest in global health, and polls consistently show it is a topic that arouses interest. I believe that a grassroots approach to this issue could reap important dividends, not the least of which would be a reprioritizing of health issues in the formulation of U.S. foreign policy.
A little bit of housework. This session is going to be recorded and edited and available for distribution after. And if you look in your welcome packet, you will have an index card. And should you, as we go along, have a question for our panelists, we will collect those. They'll be sent to me. And then, time permitting, we will ask the panel your question. Now, this presentation will be more than a history class, and no one need worry, there is no exam at the end. It will be instead an exploration of the lessons learned and questions yet unanswered about pandemics with an eye to enhancing preparedness for the next global health crisis. Now, in 1889, there was an outbreak in Russia of what became known as the Russian flu. However, it posed little cause for concern here, despite the fact that half the population of St. Petersburg, the Tsar of Russia, the King of Belgium, and the Emperor of Germany all contracted the disease. In fact, local newspapers here concentrated on the health of all of these potentates, but assumed it was all going to stay over. However, demands for treatment quickly overwhelmed the existing medical infrastructure. As depicted here in the red little box, required erection of battleground type tents or compounds to shelter the sick and dying. Now, the necessity for emergency expansion of facilities may be familiar and reminiscent of recent scenes of tents and refrigeration trucks in hospital parking lots. In short order, the pandemic reached our shores and continued in waves through 1894. Okay? 1888, 1894. Spreading by rail and sea travel eventually to all corners of the earth. Despite its relatively low fatality rate, an estimated 50 to 100 million died, claiming disproportionately the young, the infirm, and the elderly.
And very quickly we were able to develop the vaccine, which was really a way to save the world. You mentioned it, and I strongly believe it. Now, mRNA was a new technology. It is still a new technology. It was perceived at the time as being completely unknown. In fact, we started talking about mRNA, which everybody knows now, the biology of mRNA. We started talking about it in the 90s. I mean, you've seen that two scientists, Dr. Weissman and Corinne just got the recognized and obtained the Nobel Prize of Medicine for their work on mRNA, because they were able to transform the molecules so that it can become therapeutics. But it took that many years, right, to develop mRNA as therapeutics. So I do believe that what we have creating here with mRNA is a possibility for your body, our body, to manufacture by itself the medicines it needs. Right? mRNA is a code. Right? Right? So it codes for, in the case of a vaccine, it codes for a protein that is present in the virus, and it teaches your body, to recognize this protein as foreign. Right? So once you get infected, you already have your immune system is already ready for attacking this pathogen. That's how it works. But the beauty of it is that it can be developed super fast. Like traditional vaccine development with traditional technologies takes between 6 and 12 years, but we didn't have 12 years. And if you remember back at the beginning of 2020, people were dying. I think we forget a lot, right, of what was the impact of this crisis before the vaccines were available. So we didn't have 12 years, so it took 7 months.
Now, the response to that economic shock was sort of as severe as the shock itself. It was, best compared to, the patient was in cardiac arrest, and we needed something unprecedented. And both on the monetary policy and on the fiscal policy side, there was massive intervention. Interest rates were slashed. Central banks all over the world bought trillions of dollars in treasuries. On the fiscal side, as you mentioned, we spent in the United States alone over $2 trillion in pandemic aid. Same story in many European countries, same story all over the world, really. Right? Now, what that has done is it has sort of temporarily boosted, it has sort of recovered, the unemployment rate recovered surprisingly quickly. GDP growth recovered, but it has shouldered society with a lot of debt. Okay? In the United States, for example, debt has tripled from 2007 to today. It's from roughly 30% of GDP to 120% of GDP today. It's not just in the United States, it's true all over the world. Levels of public debt are higher than they have ever been sort of collectively in the world economy. Right? And so this amount of debt, one way of thinking about that is, there was a lot of private debt that the government and that the taxpayer in the world has taken on. And this will be an economic legacy that we will need to struggle with for the foreseeable future, because the debt will not pay itself back. We will have to service it, and now that interest rates are much higher, the cost of servicing that debt will be much more meaningful.
Eliminated pretty much any significant minority influence. It became a majoritarian institution. And I would argue that the Reed rules and the institutional context that stem from them created a more functional chamber. It was a chamber that was racked by dysfunction on many occasions during the late 19th century. So much so that when the Democrats took back power a couple years later in the House of Representatives, they repealed the Reed rules, but then reinstated them shortly thereafter, because they realized that in order to have the institution run, be functional, accomplish its fundamental tasks, like raising revenue and spending revenue, it needed more parliamentary control by the central leadership. And so that set the House of Representatives on its current majoritarian path. That said, about 20 years later, in 1910, there was a revolt against the Speaker. At that time, Joe Cannon was in the chair. And it's very similar to what we see is happening today. We had a Republican Party that was plagued by factionalism, and the result was a revolt against the Speaker that dramatically undercut the powers of the Speaker. The Speaker still maintained a relative central position in the institution, but not at the same height as it was during the Reagan era. We are at comparable levels of political polarization in terms of Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other side, and very little bipartisanship happening. It happens occasionally, and it happened in response to the global pandemic. If you look throughout American history, the way that significant legislation in response to crises gets passed is with broad bipartisan majorities, which many of us would think that seems impossible nowadays. That was not impossible for the pandemic, and I think we're lucky, very lucky for it in terms of the way Democrats and Republicans came together, especially given the administration at the time, which was not known for compromise. Their ability to come together, pass policies that prevented perhaps much worse outcomes in terms of public health, in terms of number of people who died and got sick because of the pandemic, and the economic fallout from the pandemic. So what is happening currently in the House of Representatives raises questions about what lessons individuals in the House, many of whom were still in the chamber back when broad bipartisan legislation was passed in response to the pandemic, in terms of what it means to compromise. And if you have a leader of the chamber, who is still very powerful by many measures, who will forge compromise, bipartisan compromise, to do things like raise the debt ceiling, or fulfill Congress's fundamental duty of passing appropriations bills, that person won't be punished for forging those kinds of coalitions when members of their own party will not provide the votes that you need with a very narrow majority in order to even get to 218 votes, which is what you need in the House of Representatives to pass legislation.
We have been involved in the problematic pathogen space since H5N1, and we started to look at what were the comparators, what were the real issues. And the true discovery we made wasn't that, oh, well, you've got to focus on the specific virus or what we're looking at. You have to focus on the big picture, what we like to call a true Odyssean approach, where you would look at the entirety of the picture, which is why we've assembled these people and another 10 to talk about what are the different aspects we should be thinking of, not just about this pandemic, but vis-a-vis other pandemics that have taken place. Richard, could you switch over to the 19 pandemic slide? You just passed it. When we look at you just passed it. Keep going. No, the other way. Yeah. There. When Jeffrey Taubenberger went out there and exhumed bodies from an Inuit village to find the H1N1 pathogen, it wasn't really that bad a pathogen. I mean, it killed people, but there were other issues around it. And it was also an influenza pathogen. So at the end of the day, was the preamble the wrong preamble? Were we looking at something that was bad, devastating, could teach us, but did it teach us the right lessons? And again, when we look at the right lessons, go to the 1893 slide.
She got COVID twice already. I didn't. My son got the previous one before COVID. So that pressure is real. And so on the other elements that I wanted to add is that yes, the World Organization are at the forefront, but here we are talking about a bigger problem, which is the problem of resources. And, as was mentioned here, the political will to do something, to invest in preparedness and in not being reactive. If we don't have the leadership of the bigger countries on this, imagine the global south that doesn't have resources even for food, how they can prepare doing so. So there is this always dystopia in the United Nations, for example, in which they are the ones to have, the ones who doesn't have. So the big challenge is that we are trying to adopt policies, global policies that help and are inclusive to everyone. And I am talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. This declaration, as I mentioned, was very difficult to accommodate language that made inclusive to all of us. And this new process, the high-level meeting for 2024 on the antimicrobial resistance, have two ambassadors to go into deal at the political level in the United Nations. And Dr. Brozak, I will be very, very honored if you can entertain the possibility to talk to them, to express to them in a very private setting, just to let them know, because there is a lot of consciousness that has to be developed between the private sector, the investment companies of this sector, the political sector in this area. That's what we have, I guess, was what Isabel was trying to also to convey. We have to come together as a as a humanity to solve this crisis.